Okay. Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to everybody here and everybody watching our YouTube presentation of the service. We are the Westside Unitarian Universalist Church. We are a church that welcomes all without respect to race, gender, and so forth, or diversity of religious beliefs, philosophical beliefs, cosmological beliefs. And kind of in line with that, this spring we've been having a series of services on different world religions, and today's service is part of that. I'll get to that later. I'm Suzanne Molnar. I'm a member of the worship committee, and I'm the worship associate for today. So, welcome on this lovely, she said hopefully, May Day, Mother's Day, celebrating mothers and all who have been. As groundbreaking psychiatrist Carrie Stack Sullivan wrote, mothering ones. This earliest 20th century American, I think it was, psychiatrist observed that mothering's a behavior. It's the nurturing of small humans. It's not related to biological parenting or by gender. So today we have a special service presented by Dr. David Howell, retired professor of philosophy and world religions, presenting on Taoism, one of this spring's series of presentations, teachings about world religions. You all, whether here or virtual, have in front of you announcements, so I'm going to go hit them very briefly. You can join us for our second Monday lunch. Next lunch will be today. Wait a minute, tomorrow. Lord, thank you. Tomorrow, Monday, 11:30 at the Bonefish Grill on Parkside Drive. If you're planning to attend, contact Judy Burchett or Diane Gray. Emails are in your announcements. Ongoing religious exploration offerings, thinking about theology, Wednesdays at 6:30, and then Thursday evening conversations that are kind of open topic. The University, the UU Women's Spirit at the Mountain, May 18th to 22nd. The registration closes today, so if you're interested in that, you need to register by today. The details for that are in your written announcements. And finally, Spirit Quest 2022. Welcome to the Interdependent Web at the Elkmont Group Camp. What's noteworthy about that in the announcements is that Brad has opened registration. You can register and pay registration fee online beginning today. Okay, that being said, we'll now have the gathering music by Sandra Thomas. David will now light the chalice, and I have a reading from the Tao Ching.
I'm going to do the singing first.
Oh, thank you. Amateurs. No.
We just invited the piano to sound, and it did so beautifully. And now we will invite the singing bowl to sound. Just relax, take a deep breath, and just listen.
From the Tao Ching. The ancient masters were profound and subtle. Their wisdom was unfathomable. There's no way to describe it. All we can describe is their appearance. They were careful as someone crossing an iced-over stream, alert as a warrior in enemy territory, courteous as a guest, fluid as melting ice, shapeable as a block of wood, receptive as a valley, clear as a glass of water. Do you have the patience to wait till your mud settles and the water is clear? Can you remain unmoving till the right action arises by itself? Sandra Thomas will now play as we have a morning offering. This is for the nurturing of this church and congregation. We are still a pretty young church congregation, and we need nurturing, care, and this is one way we get it. David, on Taoism.
She's shorter than me. I need to raise this a little bit here. My name is David Howell, and my pronouns are he and him. And talking about Taoism this morning is part of the continuing talking about different kinds of religions. Taoism is really quite different. And so what can be done in 20 minutes, I'm not clear. But one thing I decided to do is that when I'm done blathering up here, Suzanne will bring the microphone around for any questions or comments or agreements or disagreements that you have. I've done that in the past, and since for me, teaching and learning is always a matter of conversation, I'd be happy to continue the conversation a little. So as you're listening and thinking, then if you have thoughts, kind of make a note to yourself, and I'll bring it up after I am done here. and I will attempt to answer questions or not answer questions as such things go. So Taoism is the religion of the Tao, as Confucianism is the religion of Confucius, and Buddhism is the religion of the Buddha, and so on, as Christianity is the religion of the Christ. What's different here is that the Tao is usually translated as the way. But the way, the word way in English, has two quite different kinds of meanings. The one that you're most likely familiar with is way as in show me the way to San Jose, or to be more religious about it, I suppose, I am the way, and none shall come to the Father except by me. And here way means path or route, the way that you get from one place to another, with all kinds of directions and rules and so on about how one does that. But this is not the way that Taoism is the way. The way instead is the way one cooks a cake, or the way one settles arguments, or the way in which you sing, or the way in which you tell jokes. As a parenthesis here, Taoism is full of jokes. Taoists see humor as natural when it's appropriate, as being deeply serious is appropriate. And usually we think of religion as something what one is supposed to be very serious about. And indeed you are sometimes, but sometimes always you're not. So talking about the way is talking about how things are done and how one may live. When I gave my notes to Brad to put in the thing, the title is Taoism as a Way of Life. And that finally makes good sense. To think about Taoism, to feel about Taoism, to be a Taoist is to live a certain way of life, a certain style, a certain manner of doing things. What is interesting to me about Taoism, and I feel myself as a Taoist, when I ran into it, I remember my first reaction was, wow, this sounds familiar and comfortable, even though I had never heard of it before, because it fit the way in which it is appropriate for me, I thought, to feel and think. There's all kinds of things I'm kind of dropping here that will come up a little later. We will go back to them. A way of doing things. So there is a way of cooking a cake, and there is a way of doing a job, and there is a way of giving sermons, and there is a way of living. There is indeed, finally, says Taoism, a way of the world, a manner in which it is. The manner in which it flows and changes. It is the change itself. One of my favorite authors, Alan Watts, says, when you're thinking about Taoism, think verb. Although it is grammatically a noun, the Tao, think verb instead. Think process, think change, think the way that things happen. The Tao Te Ching says at one point, the Tao is older than the gods. Like most Oriental religions, Eastern religions, they didn't get into an argument about whether or not there is a God or whether or not there are gods. Sure, why would one bother to argue about that? But the idea of the Tao here is of a continual change, a continual flow, a continual manner in which life proceeds, which is older than any of the individual gods. And the individual gods are a product of that along with everything else. So a way of life, a way of the world, it is tempting, it is indeed natural at this point to say, oh, then Taoism isn't really a religion. Taoism is a way of life. How funny that is, to think that religion should be one way of going about things, and a way of life, which we would tend to call philosophical, is something else entirely. Yet we know that someone who professes one thing as a matter of their doctrine and lives in a different way, there is a name for that, and the name for that is hypocrite. But being hypocritical, again, is not something to judge. It's simply someone who hasn't managed to get into themselves the natural alliance, the natural movement between the way in which one lives and the way in which they think about things. Living and thinking are, again, natural companions, and living and thinking and feeling are natural companions. And so, what would you want a religion to be that wasn't a way of life? It's supposed to be, after all, a way of living, and it's a way of living because the Tao is the way in which everything is, the manner in which things flow. The primary symbol of Taoism is water, and I've always liked that from the time I first ran into it. Water is the most powerful of things. It erodes mountains. It changes everything that it passes through, and it itself changes. I think of, as anyone who has ever been in any high place or medium place or low place, that streams begin as little emanations from the earth and little trickles as they begin, and then they join other trickles, and then they go down steep places, and the water falls over mountains and becomes waterfalls, and then it stops in a pool that eddies about, and then it goes through rapids, and then it may become a lake for a while, and then it moves on. Water accommodates itself and changes to all the different circumstances. So to live a life like water is to live a life that is endlessly accommodating itself to all the circumstances and all the things that happen, rather than trying to push and shove and make. The religion that I grew up with, standard Presbyterian religion, was one in which the world was seen as a constant war between those things that were given to us and those things as they were supposed to be. If you yourself are at war, if you are at war with nature, if God is at war with you and God is at war with nature, Suzuki says, funny idea. The idea that there should be war between the two sides of yourself. There should be war between you and nature, war between God and nature, as if he did it wrong somehow and now has to fix it in some fashion. But that, of course, is something that I grew up with when I grew up with the notions of predestination and original sin, that these wars go on all the time. I never found that very comfortable. It wasn't as if I believed it or didn't believe it. It just seemed to me a very strange way to live. And so when I ran into Taoism and read the Tao Te Ching and thought about the possibilities here, it seemed much more pleasant to me to think that I didn't have to settle battles. I didn't have to somehow negotiate peaces in war, and of course the right side had better win, but simply see the way in which the Tao, symbolized by water, endlessly flows, fast and slow. And now you would think about, so how do I sit in a pool? If your life is a pool at the moment, just kind of resting there, no fast motion going on, what's the right way to do that? Well, it's the way pools do things. They don't have to rush. And then the pool empties out into a little rapid, and now you got to speed up a little bit, and things have to go faster. One of the things that I thought of when I used to go whitewater rafting is how to progress through rapids. What we are taught, even if it's not explicit in that teaching, is the way to deal with rapids is to overcome them, to get very strong and powerful and push your way through. But anybody who's ever done any kayaking or any whitewater rafting knows that that's exactly the wrong way to go about it. You have to let the rapid and the motion and the speed carry you. You may stick an oar in from time to time if you've got a big rock right in front of you, but it's not as if you're going to smash the rock down, and it's not as if you're going to push your way around it. You simply let it go and let it flow. There are two more things that I want to talk about. One is the notion of Yin Yang, which probably most of you have run into. Yin Yang and the symbol for Yin Yang, an old Chinese notion that was around before Taoism ever appeared, but which Taoism was able to adopt quite pleasantly and quite usefully, is the circle with the two teardrops inside, and the two teardrops nestle against each other and flow into each other. And in the center of the dark and the light is found the opposite color. In the center of the light is a dark spot, and in the center of the dark is a light spot. I find this a very attractive and mind-stimulating kind of notion, that when you take an opposite of any kind, rather than them warring against each other, they are partners. They are complements of each other. I'll talk just a little bit in a minute about different kinds of opposites we might try to think of in this way, to feel in this way. But when you do so, it is so different when you think of them not as being enemies of each other. Enemies of each other. I said I grew up in a Presbyterian church, and there is Paul, wretched creature that I am. I cannot even do the very thing I love, but I think I do the thing I hate. Poor guy. What it must be like to live a life in which not as simply you are at war with other people and you are at war with nature, you're at war with yourself. There is what you want to do and what you ought to do. And somehow you have to have the right side win, which is, of course, what you ought to do. What a recipe for disaster that is, thinking that you have to resolve these kinds of battles. Think instead here, what I want and what I ought are found in the center, the heart of each other. The more that I absorb into myself what it is that I want, I find what I ought there. And the more I think about what I ought into the center of that, the more I find what I want there. The whole way in which one lives begins to change. It is really striking. I'm looking at three young people out here, how different this is, depending on what age you were. I remember what it was like to be 13 and 15 and 17. Boy, that is a tough stretch of life. Talk about rapids. Talk about having to negotiate difficult times with hardly what seems the resources to be able to do it, and the way in which you are tossed one way or another. Well, have patience. Time will pass. If you're ready to resolve by finding opposites inside the heart of the other, to find youth within age and age within youth, then these kinds of things will be settled. When you think about yin yang, when you think about opposites, when you think about them as complements and partners of each other and leading naturally into each other, as opposed to exclusive of each other, I can have this or I can have that, but I can't have both. If you think of them as partners instead of thinking about them as warring kinds of entities, your whole way of dealing with them begins to change. So think for a moment about the kinds of opposites that come so naturally to mind: young and old, male and female, life and death, winter and summer, Some of those, I deliberately left winter and summer to the end because that works so well for my purposes at the moment. Winter, of course, leads naturally to summer. And the shortest day of the year is the first day of winter. So the same time in which things are closing down, seemingly devoid of life, is the time in which the birth of the new, flowering, fullness, greenness, filled with life is beginning to come. Think about male and female. I think again about you guys. Boy, it's tough to deal with male and female when you're 15 or 16 or whatever. Certainly was tough for me anyway, I remember that. Now it is so much more relaxed and so much easier to not have to resolve it. Suzanne mentioned that this famous psychologist whose name I forget at the moment, Harry Stack Sullivan, talked about mothering and fathering and how these are different from each other, but how they complement each other. And how nice it is if one has both of these things. How nice it is if you could find the way in which they balance each other out in both of your parents, or your parents and the other people who are engaged in the way in which you grow up. Male and female, winter and summer, life and death. Now, life and death, those are surely irreconcilable, excluding opposites, aren't they? Aren't they? Well, no, they're not. What leads more naturally to death than life? And what more naturally comes out of death than life? Life to death, to life, to death. And I'm not talking about some kind of reincarnation theory here. Taoism doesn't talk much about theories here. It talks about a kind of an attitude. In class, I taught world religions for a long time, and one of the things that I had fun with was to ask the students in a very serious tone of voice, so what happens at death? And some of them would kind of put up their hand, but of course, either they were supposed to know the answer or they were supposed not to know the answer, because this is a mystery after all. And after giving a little time, I would say, the answer to that is actually quite simple, and I know it. And then I would wait a little bit, and I would say, what happens at death? The world goes on. And you stop here for a second again. The world goes on. And I said, if that answer is unsatisfying to you, it's because I very, very carefully asked the question, what happens at death? But the question you heard me ask was, what happens to me at death? For that, of course, is what matters. The rest of the world, it's what happens to me that I want to know. Do you see the kind of consequence there? When me takes over, it's hard to think about anything else. When me takes over, it's hard to think about relationships. When me takes over, it's hard to think about the natural ways in which life continually flows and changes, and you learn and you forget, and you think about it differently, and you have more experiences. But it isn't about me. It's about death and the natural end to life. Whether it is the natural end to the life of a mosquito, or a person, or a mountain, or an ocean, whatever it may be, if there is this kind of flow going on, and you stop looking at it just from the point of view of yourself, then the way in which you can reconcile, see the constant flow back and forth of what you thought of as opposites, now becomes more possible to do. And as I get older, I find this a very comforting thing. Another thing to do about that, and here I am simply mystified. I don't know if any of you know what theory of mind is, but it is having a sense of how other people think, how other people imagine the world. Little tiny kids don't have this at all. It's one thing we begin to learn somewhere around age 3, somewhere in there, that other people have their behavior, but they also have unobservable thoughts and motives and intentions and ideas, as I do, but they may be different from me. Have I already talked quite a long time? Is that why that's doing that? Yes.
You'll be talking as long as you need to be talking.
Yeah, well, as long as I need to be talking. What one learns or can learn as you get older is that other people really are different than you. And it's hard to understand their behavior. And one of the reasons it's hard to understand the behavior of other people is that you ask yourself the question, so if I did that, what would I be thinking? What would I be intending? A great mystery that other people are very different. And Taoism talks about mysteries again and again. The mystery is that which is behind the observable and one has to feel one's way into. So I invite you to think about opposites, life and death, winter and summer, male and female, spiritual and physical, as if somehow these were at war with each other, this life and the afterlife, as if they were different things. Thinking and feeling. What a mess life is if you think that one way of dealing with life is by thinking and another way is by feeling. And somehow one of them is going to overcome the other, rather than thinking, as Yin Yang suggests, that they continuously flow into each other. And in the center of each one is the essence of the other. I think and think and think, and then I realize that finally I just feel. And I feel and feel, and then thinking about it begins to emerge and takes over. I find this going on all the time. The other thing which I wanted to talk about was when I was a child going to the Presbyterian church, you always had a reading which came from the Bible, and then the sermon was somehow based upon that. And so I asked my associate to do a reading from the Tao Te Ching. Tao Te Ching, by the way, means the sacred manual concerning the way and its power. And so I asked her to read one, and so to be, as it were, more concrete, here is the reading that you heard. The ancient masters were profound and subtle. Their wisdom was unfathomable. There is no way to describe it. All we can describe is their appearance. They were careful as someone crossing an iced-over stream. What a nice metaphor that is. Have you ever read Jack London's short story, To Build a Fire, about a man in the Arctic crossing the snowy fields at 70 below zero, and he knew that if he fell into a stream, he would surely freeze to death. And so he goes charging across the stream, and the ice gives way underneath him, and he has to build a fire. I'll leave the story at that. You can go Google it and read that story yourself, because it's a nice one. Careful as someone crossing an iced-over stream. Consider how often, and the way we progress through things, think of it as a stream with ice on top, but you're not sure how thick it is. You're not sure if it is thick in one place and thin in another. You know that you break through, you're going to be in deep trouble. And so how do you do it? It says careful. Other translations say hesitant, tentative. Do this carefully. Do not simply bull your way through it, thinking, I am so strong, I am so powerful, I can just charge across this. No, instead, be hesitant and tentative. I think in metaphors a lot. Taoists tend to think in metaphors a lot. Think about all the iced over streams that you have crossed and will cross into life. The iced over stream of puberty, the iced over stream of marriage, the iced over stream of illness, the iced over stream of old age. If you're not tentative and hesitant and careful, respectful of the kinds of things that are out there, but not simply turning around and going back, one can proceed as long as one does it with the right kind of attitude. Alert as a warrior in enemy territory. How often do many of you think of life as being enemy territory? That it is a dangerous place, after all. And there are all kinds of traps and problems out there. What can you do about it? Well, to be alert, to watch out, not fearful, not rash or too timid, but simply to be alert, to watch what's going on. It has been my experience that it's very easy for me to be alert to myself. It's a lot harder to be alert to other people. And yet there's nothing I have to do to be alert. All I need to do is to not spend so much time looking at myself and simply be alert to what's going on with the opportunities and problems that might arise. Courteous as a guest. Doesn't say there, could say, and courteous as a host. We are guests in this world of constant flowing change. We have been invited to be part of it for a while. As I invited the singing bowl to sound, we're invited to be guests here for some time, and at some point we will cease to be invited. What one can do about that? To be courteous, to be thoughtful. Fluid as melting ice. Now it's less deliberate here, but this is a powerful metaphor too. If you think of your life as a block of ice that's gradually melting, and you don't put a blowtorch to it, you don't try to simply melt it completely. Damned ice melt here. You let it melt at its own speed and its own pace. Shapeable as a block of wood. Here we are constantly carving ourselves and being carved and being shaped and being reshaped. That which is a whole gradually becomes less and less as our number of years here become fewer and fewer. And then the time will be over to say goodbye and to be able to do that without being afraid. Receptive as a valley. Valleys are low places. Valleys are places that we go. They receive the water from on high. They're not as dramatic as the tops of mountains, but they are more welcoming. Clear as a glass of water. Do you have the patience to wait till your mud settles and the water is clear? You got a nice glass of water there in front of you, your life, but it's muddy. What should you do with it? Well, you wait until the mud settles, and then the right action arises of itself. I can't force this. I can't push it. I can't make it be what I want to be. But it doesn't mean that I give up. Being patient is a kind of way of being that either one becomes comfortable or is not. To be a little bit personal here, one of my favorite TV programs was Family Feud, because it is such an absurd program. If you have never watched it, is a question is given and then you have 100 people said. And one of the questions I never forgot was, what do you lose as you get older? And the most popular answer was patience. And I was just astonished by that. I've become more patient as I've grown up. If there's anything that counts as some wisdom when you get older, surely being patient would realize how much you can change the world, how much you can respond to it, what you can do about it. All those kinds of things are a matter of simply being alert, paying attention, recognizing that you are a guest, and waiting for the right action to arise of itself. I think that's enough for me at the moment, and now I would be happy to hear you talk to each other, or ask me questions, or give thoughts, or tell me that I have been so ridiculous that you couldn't understand anything that I was saying. Whatever is your want here, my associate will bring the microphone out for whatever comments. And so the conversation is now turned over to you, of which I will be one member. One thing you can always be sure of in the UU congregation is that people are ready to talk.
Well, I have a couple of questions. First, about what time did the Tao philosophy arrive, and who wrote it down? Who wrote the book?
Yeah, about 500 BC, somewhere in there. There were some ideas that were together. It's not clear whether the person Lao Tzu, which simply means the old man, was a single person, or whether there was someone like him, or whether or not it was a combination of ideas that various people gradually changed over the centuries. But the story is a fellow named Lao Tzu, who was an old man, who at the end of his life, when he realized that he had done what he could and it was time to spend that time by himself, the quiet, cool time of his life, went into the mountains in the west of China. And as he was going, the person guarding the gate said, "Oh, we have heard that you are so wise. Would you please tell us what it is that you have learned?" And Lao Tzu looks at him and says, "Okay," and writes down in the Tao Te Ching, the book of 5,000 characters, that says, "Here." It goes off on its own. I love that story. You know all the other stories of all the dramatic, glorious, world-changing things. Somebody just said, "Time for me to be by myself for the last part of my life. You want something to be written down? Here it is. And now I'm on my way. Figure this out for yourself." About 500 BC.
Okay. Now, the other question is, how does this philosophy deal with phenomena like a war that's going on right now? When somebody like Putin invades another country and starts killing lots of people, how does the Tao deal with that?
What the Tao says is, the way the Tao is that there are different ways to respond to different circumstances. The way one deals with a period of peacefulness is different than the way in which dealing with the war. But the way is to respond to the kind of condition that it is. Taoists tend to be peaceable. Let me see. There's a wonderful, one of my favorite passages. Let me see if I can quickly find it here. I probably won't be able to. No, I knew that I wouldn't be able to find it quickly enough. It goes like this, that
If war is necessary as the last possible thing, remember that your enemies are human beings like yourself. To go to a war is the way you go to the ceremony of any death with great regret. But sometimes one must do it. So it doesn't give specific directions, which will vary from war to war, but what it does say is always do this with an attitude of, instead of judging and blaming others, try to become more aware of how they are driven. Putin, in a different kind of religious tradition, is surely inhabited by demons, which just drive him. How shall we respond to them? When one is going through rapids, you don't just lay the oar down, and just let yourself drift. But it doesn't mean that you fight it and overcome it. And so, in the case of things like the war, one must deal as best you can and continually pay attention to the responses that you're getting. We would call it diplomacy. Diplomacy has got different kinds of connotations. The other thing that you said, it is tempting, indeed it is natural to say, oh, this isn't a religion, this is a philosophy. That's a joke, folks. As if religion and philosophy were another yin and yang, and one is supposed to be in charge and the other is supposed to give up. Religion leads naturally to philosophy, and philosophy leads naturally to religion. So the author of the Tao Te Ching and many, many wise people have said for century after century after century, to think one must distinguish philosophy from religion as if they were at war with each other, or one was trying to take over and the other really ought to be in charge, is a function to a great extent of the particular history of Europe and then the United States, the particular history of Europe. And that kind of history didn't arise in India and China and Korea and Japan and Southeast Asia. They saw philosophy as one way of being religious, and religion as one way in which philosophy naturally expresses itself. I'm a philosopher, and when I started teaching world religions, I thought, wow, how am I going to do this? I don't know much about it at all. I don't think of myself as being very religious. That's because I had a notion of religion which was somehow at odds with philosophy, and it's better than one or the other. Same thing with spiritual and physical. Second chapter of this continuing sermon will be the last Sunday of this month, in which I want to talk about how one can be a purely physically oriented person and be spiritual also. Spiritual and physical is another one. But philosophy and religion, they are not exclusive opposites, nor are they just kind of mushed into each other. One leads naturally to the other and is found in the heart of the other. Enough. Next. Let Suzanne bring that microphone up.
I think I heard you say that a young child doesn't have a theory of mind. Now,
Yes, comes in
I have seen the situation where you give a toddler a small container of candy, and the toddler takes one and offers one back. I think that's evidence of a theory of mind, understanding that if I enjoy these, you would enjoy it as well. Okay.
It arises pretty early, yes, and I would agree with you. That's one of those things. What would the other person like? I can't see what he would like or want. All I can see is the behavior here, and one of the symptoms of, one of the behaviors of developing a theory of mind is recognizing that other people have unobservable feelings and wants and desires.
Then there's the matter of mirroring. You can take a baby who maybe has not seen a mirror or observed his or herself in the mirror, and you look at the baby and you stick out your tongue and the baby will respond by sticking out their tongue as well. Now, how do they know that this thing in their body is the same as, that they've never seen, is the same as the one in your body?
Maybe they're in the process of learning it. Maybe they're experimenting. Maybe they're trying. One thing that popped into my mind there was, so how would a Taoist think about this kind of question? A Taoist would think, if I had the attitude of always being ready to learn, always paying attention, always realizing, here's something I know, wow, that was surprising, I wonder what's going on there. And how marvelous it would be if we were able to keep that kind of attitude on through the rest of our lives, which is, of course, one of the reasons we're doing this series on other religions, in which they do have different kinds of ways of asking and answering the kinds of questions that life presents.
Well, another mirroring would be looking at this baby and smiling, and they will smile back. To what extent is a child who comes up and gives you a hug? It would seem that that is an expression of a theory of mind. They enjoy being hugged, so they hug others.
Okay.
So I think...
Yeah, Jonas, I'm not interested in agreeing or disagreeing with you here. The things that cross my mind is the way in which some of us, as we get older, somehow forget this. We learned how to smile early on in responses to someone else's smile. And then I know people, I think, this is kind of a mystery, but I think, who have somehow learned that a smile is some kind of deliberately made social practice to pretend to be something, but they don't know what a smile itself really is. What astonishes me here is things we can learn and then things we can forget. And we forget them when our minds become so closed that we're not constantly looking at the behavior of other people. And then something may happen, and now we're able to suddenly be awake to, awaken to, open to other kinds of possibilities. I think it happens fairly early, and there's a set of experiments, and after we're done here, I'd be happy to talk with you about them. But really, really tiny kids don't seem to be able to imagine that other human beings are like them in some ways. And then I think, from my own experience, I forget that other human beings are radically different from me in some ways. And I ask myself the question, if I was doing that, what would I be wanting, intending, and so on? Instead of saying, what would they be? But happy to carry this conversation after the formal part of this is done.
I saw.
I feel so sorry for you having to deal with scientists in the audience on this topic. I mean, my first thought of Jonas's response is like both of us have sort of the reactionary response to whatever's being said of, you know, looking for contradictions. And in response to what he was saying, I was thinking, well, it's probably very adaptive for babies to respond to their parents, and it would increase their fitness in the long run. So regardless of whether it actually involves a lot of mental processing, it would be selected for over time. But that wasn't what I was going to originally say. Yeah. I'm just reacting to the reaction. I love the two physical analogies, the one about walking carefully across ice and the one about going down a whitewater river. And in both cases, I had sort of this reactionary response. And one is that I remember walking with my mother, and she was being very careful on the ice on the sidewalk in upstate New York. And I used to always advise her to stamp down her feet, not to be careful, because by being careful, you're more likely to fall, or to just sort of skate along with it, you know. And the other example is going down whitewater paddling, and what I recall being told when I was rafting is that you need to not just dilly-dally in those eddies, you need to keep paddling, to get through them. But anyway, I'm being way too literal and just wanted to point those out because that's the kind of oppositional, critical person that I am as a scientist.
Respond to the first one anyway. The word that this translation uses is careful. Other translations use tentative or hesitant. And it's as if there's two choices. Either I go, that kind of sticking a toe out, no, maybe dangerous, backing up. That's option number one. Option number two, which apparently appeals to you, is there is a third option. The third option is, with respect and concern, moving forward all the time, knowing what's there, paying attention to it, seeing how it reacts, but continuing to move. Neither frightened and backing away, nor simply charging through and smashing it to bits. I found that third option works well for me. That's one reason I like to think of myself as a Taoist. That's a way of doing things which allows me to seek opportunities, but not simply, grab them by the neck the way Homer does with Bart, and try and choke it to death.
Does Taoism rest heavily on concepts of good and bad, or does it sort of reject or not talk about concepts of good and bad or right and wrong?
And again, it's hard to find the passage there exactly, but there's one, is the good man is the one who is good to everyone. Very reminiscent of love your enemies, very reminiscent of that kind of never judging, never blaming, never punishing, which Jesus was reported to have said. As to whether there's any final difference there, I, Carol, don't really know, and I think that would vary from Taoist to Taoist. I deliberately did not mention that when I mentioned life and death and winter and summer and so on. I didn't mention good and bad, because that gets on, we talk about, dangerous winter ice. If you say that the evil is found in the heart of the good, and good is found in the heart of evil, was, for one thing, way too much to try to deal with in however minutes I had here. And two, something that I have never really settled for myself. And one of the passages from the Tao Te Ching says, the one who is good to everyone, the one who is ready to respond to everyone, is the person that we should emulate. And you do find that kind of attitude in a number of different religions. I would think that part of St. Francis Assisi, the part in which he's out there feeding birds, not the part in which he's whipping himself with his hat of nine tails, that part of St. Francis would be very comfortable with Lao Tzu.
That's pretty yin and yang, though, that description of St. Francis, right?
Which is yin and yang?
That description of St. Francis, the part of him out feeding birds and the part of him.
Oh, no, sorry, Carol. That is not yin and yang at all. That is somebody saying, oh, I gotta be this way. No, I don't. I gotta be this way.
So it's like the yin and yang separated.
Yes, forgetting about the way in which they flow into each other. Forgetting about the way in which they are complements of each other. Forgetting about the way in which they can be appropriate to each other in different kinds of circumstances. Yes, I am not a Christian, and one of the reasons I'm not a Christian is that kind of continual warring going on just doesn't fit me, doesn't work for me. I like a much more, it's hard to not have praising adjectives here, nuanced, thoughtful, and so on way of doing things. Let me mention kind of briefly what there isn't in Taoism. There isn't a hierarchy, other than Tai Chi There isn't a ritual. You don't have priests and ministers. You don't have life after death. You don't have a God. Those are some of the reasons why it's not considered a religion. But what it is, as a way of life, is to base one's life upon the sense of the flow of all of the world and then live accordingly. And for some people, and I am one of them, this kind of thing works. And those who know something about my personal history, in the last few years, I have gone through some very unexpected kinds of changes in things. And this kind of attitude has been good for me. Well, thank you for the opportunity. I invite you to come on the last Sunday of the month, in which I will say, you do not have to believe in woo-woo stuff to be spiritual.